Dear learners, welcome to Module 5. In this module, we are going to look at the pandemic and what impacts the pandemic is having on the AfCFTA. As you know, the world was unprepared for the COVID-19 pandemic when it appeared in the closing days of 2019 in China, and then it is spread out like wildfire across the globe in a matter of weeks. It has claimed some 4.6 million lives in Africa, and the death toll keeps rising. And the sad thing is that no end is in sight yet. The pandemic has forced economies to lock down, pushing millions into joblessness and poverty, as we are going to see in this module. It has disrupted global value chains and caused food shortages and trade disturbances across the world and in Africa. The poorest countries have been the hardest hit. As far as the AfCFTA is concerned, the pandemic occurred at a time when Africa was getting ready to roll out the agreement and to start trading under the terms of the FTA. Consequently, the pandemic has caused delays in the negotiations and has raised concerns about implementation. In this module, we shall look into the socioeconomic effects of the pandemic on African economies and government responses to it. More importantly, we will consider its implications for the AfCFTA and more broadly for continental integration in Africa. Specifically, this module will help you assess the socioeconomic effects of COVID-19 in African countries, critically consider government measures taken to address the economic impacts of the pandemic, evaluate the effects of the pandemic on the implementation of the AfCFTA agreement, understand the role of regional integration and of the AfCFTA in cushioning the impacts of COVID-19 as economies strive to build back better. This notion of building back better has become a global mantra, and we will see how Africa can actually build back better using the AfCFTA. And finally, I would expect you to appreciate the lessons that the pandemic offers for regional integration and the implementation of the AfCFTA. The COVID-19 pandemic has shaken health systems and economies, societies and governments across the world. No one saw it coming, and only when it hit us that we realized how ill-prepared we were for a pandemic of this kind. At the global level, COVID-19 has infected more than 220 million people and caused over 4.6 million deaths. According to CDC data, CDC stands for the Center for Disease Control, there are close to 8 million cases in Africa as we speak. And you will see that the data on the slides will have to be updated because these numbers are changing by the day. So there are close to 8 million cases in Africa and over 200,000 deaths. Sadly, these numbers will rise in the future. The pandemic has taken the world a couple or more years back. Its impacts vary across countries depending on the economic and demographic structures and the quality of the government's policy responses. Developing countries have seen the efforts towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, seriously dented. Africa, which is home to 33 of the world's 46 least developed countries, is particularly exposed to the damaging impacts of the pandemic. Let us delve into the socioeconomic effects of the pandemic. First, it is important to point out that infection rates vary across Africa, with Southern Africa worse hit by the pandemic. Vaccination rates also vary considerably, ranging from about 68% in Seychelles to nearly 0% in several countries. Theoretically, there are different but complementary channels through which the pandemic impacts economies and societies. One approach used by the World Bank, among others, looks at the demand side and supply side channels. Demand side channels include impacts on the components of aggregate demand, such as consumption, investment, trade, and travel. Supply side channels, on the other hand, refer to the disruptions in production due to lockdowns, sanitary barriers, and restrictions on the movement of people. In a recent study, UNDP considers the first order, second order, and third order effects arising from the pandemic. So this is another way of classifying, of looking into the socioeconomic effects of the pandemic. The first order effects are the health-related effects. The second order effects result from confinement measures or lockdown measures. And the third order effects are effects that are translated, that are transmitted through international channels. Let us begin by looking at how the pandemic has affected and continues to affect growth and poverty in Africa. Africa's GDP declined by 2.1% in 2020. The decline was sharper for tourism-dependent economies, which contracted by 11.5% on average, and on resource-intensive countries, which saw growth slumped to negative 4.7%. Regionally, East Africa posted a rather spectacular positive GDP growth of 0.7%. On the other hand, GDP contracted by 7% in Southern Africa. The World Bank estimates that globally, 97 million people slipped into poverty in 2020. That is last year. 30 million of them were in Africa, which means Africa accounts for about 30% or 1/3 of the world's population that were pushed into poverty as a result of the pandemic. It appears that populations with lower levels of education, fewer assets, and in informal jobs are most at risk of falling into extreme poverty. And the effect of short-term survivalist measures, such as keeping children away from school or forcing them to work to support family incomes, will have long-term impacts, transforming transient or transitory poverty into chronic poverty. World output is expected to rebound to 6% in 2021. However, in Africa, growth this year is expected to be 3.4%, meaning that economic recovery will remain subdued. Globally, poverty will decrease by about 3% in 2021. However, Africa will be the only region in the world where poverty will increase by 2.5%, which is equivalent to 39 million more people being pushed into poverty in 2021, that is this year. Remittances are important to many African households as they support their incomes and consumption. Globally, remittances fell by about $100 billion or 20% in 2020 compared to the previous year, 2019. In Africa, fortunately, the decline was smaller, with remittances falling by 8.7% to reach $78 billion in 2020. The decline is expected to continue in 2021, though at a slower pace of negative 5.8%. The drop in remittance flows to Africa has worsened the foreign exchange shortage and reduced import cover in several African countries. In particular, in West Africa, which features some of the most remittance-dependent economies, for example, Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal. The importance of foreign direct investment, or FDI, to Africa cannot be emphasized enough. Globally, FDI inflows declined by a whopping 42% in 2020. FDI in Africa fell by 10% in 2019 and by a further 16% in 2020 to reach $40 billion. It is expected to recover by 5% in 2021 and return to pre-pandemic levels in 2022. But much uncertainty remains. And uncertainty is the number one deterrent of FDI. However, FDI can benefit from the future conclusion of an investment protocol in the AfCFTA agreement. As you know, negotiations are currently ongoing to implement on investment, and hopefully it will be concluded soon. So now is the time to act if we want to minimize the damage to African economies, and it turns out that the AfCFTA can contribute much in that direction, as we will talk about in this module. Let's talk about the impact on aid or overseas development assistance. Contrary to most financial flows, ODA proved rather resilient to the crisis. It actually rose by 3.5% in 2020 to reach an all-time high of $160 billion. Bilateral aid to Africa increased 4.1%. However, much uncertainty hovers about future aid flows as donor countries are more focused on their own domestic issues and as they face severe budget constraints. Let us conclude our analysis of the socioeconomic impacts by looking at the effects of the pandemic on trade. World merchandise trade fell by 5.3% in 2020, more than the global GDP, which contracted by 3.8%. African exports declined by 0.5% in 2019, and more sharply by 8.1% in 2020. Much of this decline can be attributed to steep declines in oil exports and to some extent commodity exports. Tourism-dependent economies, many of which are small island states, have also been heavily impacted. Global economic recovery in 2021 is expected to boost Africa's exports by 8.1% and imports by 5.5%. However, it is forecasted that the pandemic may cause permanent changes in Africa's trade patterns. China will emerge to dominate Africa's trade even more. According to a UNDP study of 10 African countries, the pandemic is unlikely to have any significant impact on intra-Africa trade. But as we discuss later, it may very well have a positive impact on regional trade. Governments across the world have responded swiftly to the pandemic. The priority has been to protect lives, but the crippling health systems in Africa were overwhelmed, leading to a large number of fatalities. On the other hand, lockdowns and other confinement measures have helped save lives, but they have also compromised livelihoods. Governments have deployed a wide array of measures to address the economic impacts of the pandemic. The IMF has classified the COVID-19 related policy measures into three groups: fiscal, monetary and macro-financial, and exchange rate and balance of payments. Fiscal measures include income and food support, wage assistance, tax relief, and deferrals for MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises. So deferrals would mean like these enterprises won't have to pay loans right away. They won't have to pay taxes right away. In other words, they are given more time to pay loans and taxes. Monetary and macro-financial measures would include reduction in policy rates, which would result in lower interest rates, reduction in prudential ratios, subsidized credit to small and medium enterprises, and loan guarantee schemes. Many countries have actually rolled out these monetary measures. And finally, exchange rate and balance of payments measures would include currency depreciation and rationing of foreign exchange in some cases. The World Bank and the OECD provide a taxonomy of government policy responses focused on MSMEs. This includes labor-related measures, deferrals, financial instruments, and structural policies. Labor-related measures would include wage subsidies, wage assistance to the self-employed, deferrals comprise income tax, VAT, and social contribution deferrals. In other words, these payments may be due at a later date. Financial instruments include loan guarantees, concessional lending to small, medium, and micro enterprises, grants and subsidies. Structural policies would include assistance to enable teleworking, training, and redeployment. On the whole, there has been a preference for short-term survivalist measures. Structural policies, on the other hand, have rarely been resorted to. Let us take a critical look at the effectiveness of government policy response to the pandemic. The scale, quality, timing, and effectiveness of government interventions vary widely across countries and regions. It appears that the size of economic stimulus packages measured as a percentage of GDP is bigger in richer countries, not surprisingly, because these countries have more resources. They have a bigger war chest. However, there appears to be a weak correlation between the size of government response and its impact, especially on MSMEs. This means that the spending capacity of governments has done little to help save many small businesses in Africa and elsewhere. In part, this is because the uncertainty around the pandemic has pushed economic agents into a precautionary overdrive mode. And if consumers don't spend, businesses can't thrive. But the evidence also suggests that high debt levels in Africa have constrained the size of government responses. Significantly, 22 African countries have debt to GDP ratios in excess of the prudential level of 60%. This has led to calls for debt relief for heavily indebted countries. And the international community's response has generally been positive, even if inadequate, relative to Africa's COVID-related financing needs, which have been estimated at $200 billion. So, how has the pandemic impacted the implementation of the AfCFTA agreement? I'm sure you're speculating about that. Well, not surprisingly, it has led to major delays. Delay in the coming into effect of the trade protocol, which was initially scheduled for 1st July 2020. Some phase one negotiations have also been delayed and they remain to be finalized. The deadline for concluding phase two negotiations, which was meant to be the end of 2020, was initially pushed back to June 2021, but there is now a mandate to extend the deadline by at least another year. And as we noted earlier, e-commerce may be treated separately in a third phase of the negotiations. On a more positive note, the negotiations are now expected to gather momentum with the adoption of the African Virtual Trade Diplomacy Platform, an online platform that has been rolled out by the African Union. Moreover, trading under the agreement has started at the beginning of this year with just a 6-month delay. And the AfCFTA Secretariat was commissioned in the midst of the pandemic and is now operational. The Secretariat is working with the African Import-Export Bank to pilot a model Pan-African payment and settlement system in West Africa. So it has gotten down to work without delay. Let us turn to the pandemic's impacts on African regional integration more generally. These impacts are positive as well as negative. On the positive side, first, the delays caused by the pandemic could have long-term consequences for continental integration plans. Second, several instances of a failure of intergovernmental coordination among African countries occurred during the pandemic. The fact that African governments failed to coordinate during the pandemic and some went against commitments that they had undertaken go against the principles of solidarity and cooperation embedded in the AfCFTA agreement. And this needs to be rectified. Third, the pandemic also provoked a rise in nationalism and protectionism in many parts of the world, including in Africa. Again, this is contrary to the spirit of regional integration. On a positive note, however, the pandemic has underscored the need to deepen regional integration by implementing the AfCFTA agreement comprehensively and expeditiously. African countries are becoming increasingly aware that regional integration can be a pathway to greater regional self-sufficiency or food security, that regional integration can make up for Africa's declining trade with the rest of the world, that African regional value chains can offer good opportunities for diversification and exports, that the AfCFTA can help economies build back better. Building back better has become a mantra as the world focuses on recovering sustainably from the pandemic. Sustainable recovery means that it is now time to refocus on the sustainable development goals and to make sure that as we recover, we do not leave anyone behind. Moreover, there was great enthusiasm in the business community for the launch of the trade trade under the agreement at the beginning of the year. The fact that the business community pressed governments for trading under the AfCFTA to commence without further delay augurs well for the future of the AfCFTA. It means that the business community is very much supportive of the AfCFTA. Finally, it is becoming clear that the implementation of the AfCFTA has been delayed, but that it has not been thwarted by the pandemic. Let us conclude by thinking about some lessons that the pandemic offers for the AfCFTA. First, there is no rush. There is no need to rush. Rushing things during a pandemic can lead to a loss of interest as policymakers focus on more urgent priorities. As one author has aptly put it, Africa's, and I'm quoting, Africa's integration agenda must be aspirational, but not to the extent that its ambitions are misaligned to reality, creating despondency. I think it's very well said. Second, African policymakers must avoid policy responses, for example, import restrictions that undermine the agreement. These short-sighted responses create long-term damage. Third, building back better requires that recovery be inclusive, meaning that gains from the AfCFTA should be widely shared. Otherwise, the AfCFTA will create the erroneous impression that it benefits some countries only. This must be avoided at all costs. Fourth, African countries should aim for self-sufficiency at the regional, not national level. The pursuit of self-sufficiency at the national level will only open the doors to import substitution policies that all too often fail. However, a regional response to Africa's need for self-sufficiency is a more achievable goal, and it can be coordinated by the AU under existing AU mechanisms, such as the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, or CADEP, and the IDA Action Plan, which we talked about in the previous module. IDA, let's recall, it stands for Accelerated Industrial Development of Africa. Last but not least, the pandemic has revealed Africa's vulnerabilities in dramatic fashion, and it has highlighted the need for structural transformation, which has proved elusive up till now. The AfCFTA agreement, along with the AU's strategies and instruments, including CADEP and IDA, as we mentioned just now, can help in this process. These are useful lessons. They are not new, but they are often forgotten or ignored. I hope the pandemic has emphasized these lessons in a way that policymakers pay heed to them. And that brings us to the end of Module 5. I look forward to taking you through the last module of this course. Happy learning, and see you soon.